My son's fiancé stood in front of my grandmother's vanity, applying eye cream that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and told me it was time I found somewhere more appropriate for a woman my age. I remember the exact sound of the word leaving her mouth, light, almost cheerful, the way you'd suggest a restaurant instead of a life sentence, and I remember thinking, with a kind of detached clarity that surprised me even at the time, that I should probably say something back. I didn't, not yet. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my sewing room and watched morning light throw little rainbows across her crystal perfume bottles, and I let the silence stretch just long enough that she glanced up to see if I'd heard her. I was 68, not 98. I ran 5 miles every other morning, I still taught piano to 11 kids from the neighborhood, and I just spent the previous Saturday on my knees in a garden the local paper had photographed twice. But that word, appropriate, landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, and I felt the ripples of it for the rest of that day. I want you to sit with 3 things before I tell you anything else, because they're the reason you're going to want to stay for the rest of this. 3 weeks after that morning, I was on a terrace overlooking the Mediterranean Sea with a glass of champagne in my hand, while my son sat in a lawyer's waiting room back home, trying to understand how the house he thought was his had been sold out from under him. He had no idea what I actually had in the bank. Neither did his fiancée, who'd spent 18 months redecorating my life around the assumption that I had nothing. And the letter I left them on the kitchen counter that morning, the one they wouldn't find until I was already somewhere over the Atlantic, was going to answer every question they'd never once thought to ask me. My name is Diane Halstead. Most people who have known me more than a week call me Dee. I'm 68 years old, I grew up outside Providence, Rhode Island, and until the morning I'm about to tell you about, I thought the hardest thing I'd ever survive was losing my husband. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about a lot of other things too, which is really what this story is about. If you're the kind of person who believes it's never too late to stop being convenient for other people, I think you're going to like it here. I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to Revenge Lab before you go, not because the number matters to me, but because there's something worth sharing about a woman who finally stopped asking permission to take up space in her own life, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one. Now let me back up, just a little, because you need to understand the woman standing in that doorway before you'll understand what she did next. 5 years earlier, my husband Walter had a heart attack in the garage while he was sanding down a bookshelf he'd promised to finish for our son's apartment. He was 66. We'd been married 41 years, raised one son together, and built a life inside a 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that had, at that point, only been in the paper once. Walter ran a cabinetry business he'd started with a single table saw in a rented garage bay, and for 4 decades he'd handled every number that mattered in our household: the mortgage, the investments, the insurance, while I raised our son, kept the house running, and taught piano to whichever neighborhood kids' parents called asking if I had room. When Walter died, I stopped being a person for a while and became something closer to a ghost who happened to still cook dinner. I wandered our house touching things he'd built. I sat in his chair. I tended the roses we'd planted together on our 30th anniversary like they were the last living piece of him I had left. That's the state I was in when my son Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table, 6 weeks after the funeral, and told me it would be smart, for tax purposes, to put the house in his name. I remember the exact weight of that afternoon, because I've replayed it enough times since that it's worn smooth in my memory, the way a stone gets worn smooth from being turned over in your pocket. Ethan had come by with a folder from an estate attorney he'd found on his own. A young, efficient man named Barrett who had, Ethan assured me, done this exact thing for a dozen families and would save us both a great deal of trouble down the road. "It's just a transfer, Mom," Ethan said, sliding the folder across the table the way I would learn much later. His father-in-law would slide an envelope across a different kitchen counter in a story I hadn't heard yet and never would. Barrett explained it. If the house stays in your name and something happens to you, it goes through probate, taxes, months of paperwork. If it's already in my name, none of that happens. It's simpler for everyone, cleaner. "Simpler for you," I said, though I said it gently, and I meant it more as an observation than an accusation. "Simpler for both of us," he said. "I don't want you dealing with lawyers and courts on top of everything else, Mom. Let me handle this one thing. Let me take care of you the way Dad would want me to." I want to tell you I hesitated. I didn't, not really, not the way I should have. I was 6 weeks into a grief so total it had rearranged the furniture of my own mind, and my son was sitting across from me offering to carry something, anything, off my shoulders. I signed where Barrett's yellow tabs told me to sign, on a document I did not read past the first page, because reading felt, that particular week, like a physical task my body simply couldn't perform. "It'll make things simpler down the road, Mom," Ethan said again, as if repeating it might make it truer. "You won't have to think about it." Ethan was 35 then, with his father's height and my stubbornness, working in marketing for a software company in the city. He'd just gotten engaged to a woman named Chloe Denning, who worked in fashion merchandising and had a way of complimenting a room while quietly deciding everything wrong with it. I trusted my son completely. He was the only child I had, the center of the only family I had left. So I signed the transfer papers at that same kitchen table without reading past the first page, because after Walter died, reading contracts felt like one more thing my body simply couldn't do that week. Family takes care of family. That's what Walter and I had believed our entire marriage, and I saw no reason that belief should stop working now that he was gone. 18 months before the morning I'm telling you about, Ethan and Chloe moved in with me. "Just temporarily," Ethan said, "while we save for our own place." I was thrilled. The house had been too quiet for too long, and I welcomed them with both arms open, cleared out the guest room, moved my sewing machine to the basement without being asked twice, rearranged 30 years of habits around theirs. The first cracks were small enough that I told myself I was imagining them. My craft table disappeared from the sunroom one Tuesday while I was volunteering at the animal shelter. The living room furniture had been rearranged by the time I got home from yoga. Small things, the kind of thing you don't mention out loud because mentioning it makes you sound like the difficult one. And then came the morning with the vanity, the eye cream, and the word appropriate, and I stopped being able to tell myself I was imagining anything at all. I should tell you, before I go further, exactly what that morning followed, because I think it matters. The afternoon before, I'd had my regular Thursday lesson with a 9-year-old named Lucy Abernathy, who'd been coming to my sunroom every week for 2 years to work through her scales with the kind of scowling determination only a 9-year-old can summon for something she secretly loves. She'd been stuck for a month on a chop-in prelude, rushing the left hand every time, and that Thursday, for the first time, she'd gotten all the way through without stopping. "You did that," I told her, and she'd beamed at me like I'd handed her the moon. Her mother, waiting in the doorway with her coat still on, had lingered afterward. "I don't know what you do in here," she said, "but she talks about your lessons more than she talks about school. Whatever it is, thank you." I tell you this because I want you to understand something before you watch two people decide I was a burden. I was not a woman quietly fading into the wallpaper of her own life. I had 11 students who counted on me every week. I had a garden that strangers stopped their cars to photograph. I had 30 years of proof that I knew exactly how to build something that lasted, patiently, one unglamorous hour at a time. Whatever Ethan and Chloe believed they were looking at when they looked at me, they were not looking very closely. The room had been mine once. My grandmother's vanity had stood under that window for 25 years, and I'd hung the wallpaper behind it myself, on a ladder, with Walter holding the bottom corners and telling me I was doing it crooked. Now it held Chloe's makeup collection, spread across the glass top like museum pieces, crystal bottles, gold compact cases, a ring light she'd installed for video calls with clients. Morning sun caught all of it and threw little rainbows across the wall I'd papered by hand. "Morning, Dee," she said, without turning around, dabbing cream under her eyes with the concentration of a surgeon. "Good morning, sweetheart." I stepped into the doorway of what used to be my sewing room, and if there was an edge in my voice, I don't think she heard it. She never heard the edges. That was, in its own way, the whole problem with Chloe. She moved through the world assuming every room had already agreed with her before she walked into it. "I was thinking," she said, capping the eye cream, we should probably talk about the living situation. My chest tightened, but I kept my voice level. What about it? She turned then, meeting my eyes in the mirror instead of in the actual room, which told me something too, though I didn't have the language for it yet. Ethan and I have been talking. We think it's time for some changes. We're not kids anymore. We need space to build our own life. Of course, I said. Have you found somewhere you'd like to move? Her laugh was bright and sharp at the same time, like wind chimes caught in a gust that was about to become a storm. Oh, Dee, you're so sweet. No, we were thinking more that, well, this is Ethan's childhood home. His inheritance, technically, and you've had such a good run here, but maybe it's time you found your own little place. Something more appropriate for a woman your age. There it was. I'd been 68 for 4 months. I ran 5 miles every other morning. I'd maintained this 4-bedroom colonial with its wraparound porch for 30 years, painted every room myself, refinished every floor, nursed every piece of furniture through decades of wear. This is my home, Chloe, I said quietly. She stood, smoothing leggings that probably cost more than my monthly heating bill. Well, technically it's in Ethan's name now, isn't it? Since the transfer, after Walter died. My throat closed around the truth of that. She was right, in the narrowest legal sense, and I hated that she knew it, hated more that she'd clearly discussed it with my son in enough detail to bring it up so casually, over eye cream, like she was mentioning the weather. I just think, she went on, reaching for her lip gloss now, it would be better for everyone if you found your own space. Something smaller, easier to manage. There are some lovely senior communities not far from here. Senior communities? The phrase made my skin crawl. I wasn't interested in organized craft hour and early bird dinner specials. I still taught 11 piano students a week. I still volunteered at the shelter on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My garden had been in the local paper twice. Where's Ethan? I asked. Shower, she said, capping the gloss with a decisive click. But we've already talked about it, Dee. He agrees, it's time. I stood there another moment, watching her adjust her workout top in my mother-in-law's mirror, completely at ease discussing my future like I was a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor she had in mind. Then I walked downstairs to make coffee, bare feet silent on the hardwood I'd had refinished 2 years earlier, and I let the ordinary rhythm of that kitchen, the gurgle of the coffee maker, the herb garden thriving on the windowsill, basil and rosemary and thyme in neat rows, steady something in me that wanted, very badly, to start shaking. This kitchen had been the center of our family for 3 decades. Thousands of meals, birthday parties, holiday dinners. The scratches on the butcher block told stories nobody in this house but me still remembered. Morning, Mom. Ethan appeared in the doorway, hair damp, wearing the expensive athleisure that had become his uniform since the engagement. I poured him coffee with cream, the way he'd taken it since he was 12, and he didn't quite meet my eyes when he took the mug. Chloe mentioned she talked to you, he said, about the living situation. I took a slow sip of my own coffee, the good beans I ordered from a small roaster upstate, one of the few luxuries I still allowed myself. It was perfect timing, actually. I was just thinking about the future myself. She's right, you know, Ethan continued, leaning against the counter I'd had installed when he was in high school. This place is a lot for you to manage alone. I manage it just fine, I said. Mom, come on. The gutters, the deck, the yard work, it's a lot for someone your age. Someone your age. The same phrase Chloe had used, like 68 was a diagnosis instead of a birthday. Like I was tottering behind a walker instead of running 5 miles before most of the neighborhood was awake. The gutters were cleaned last month by the same service I've used for 5 years, I said, my voice still calm but with something new sharpening underneath it. The deck gets power washed every spring. The gardens are in the paper regularly, in case you've forgotten. Ethan shifted, uncomfortable. It's not about that, it's about us building our own life. Chloe wants to start a family soon, we need room to grow. This house has 4 bedrooms, I pointed out. Mom, his tone was the exact one he'd used at 16 when he thought I was being unreasonable about a curfew. We're adults. We can't live with my mother forever. Then move out, I said simply. He looked at me like I'd suggested he fly to the moon unassisted. Move out? "Mom, this is my house, my inheritance. Dad left it to me." "Dad left it to both of us," I corrected. "I transferred it to your name for tax purposes. There's a difference, and you know there is." He set his mug down with more force than necessary. "We've been patient. We've lived here a year and a half, contributing to expenses." Contributing to expenses. They'd bought groceries exactly twice. They'd never once offered to help with the mortgage, the utilities, or a single repair bill. I'd been too proud to ask, too grateful for the company in a house that had felt cavernous after Walter died. "I think it would be best," he went on, "if you found somewhere more appropriate. Maybe one of those senior communities where you'd have people your own age around you." People your own age. As if aging were a contagious condition requiring quarantine from the young and vibrant. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the small earthquake happening behind my ribs. "There are some nice places, Mom. We've been looking into it. Sunrise Meadows got a great reputation, 20 minutes from here. You'd have your own apartment, activities, meal plans." He paused, and something in his face shifted into a register I recognized even then, though I didn't yet have a name for it. "And honestly, it'll look good. People will see you're being taken care of instead of, I don't know, rattling around a house too big for one person. It reflects on the whole family, Mom, whether you like that or not. It reflects on the whole family, not I want you safe, not even I want you happy." My son was worried about how my address would read to the people at his office. They'd been researching senior facilities for me, while living in my house, sleeping in my guest room, eating food I'd bought, using utilities I paid for. "And if I don't want to move?" I asked. Something flickered across his jaw, and for one uncomfortable second I saw his father in his worst moments. Walter had a temper when he was young before he learned to sit on it. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. The house is legally mine. I'm trying to be reasonable, but if you're going to be stubborn about it." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The threat hung in that kitchen like wood smoke. My own son was threatening to evict me from the house where I'd raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him for 35 years. "I understand," I said quietly. Relief flooded his face so fast it was almost funny. "Good, we'll help you look, get you settled somewhere nice. Could be an adventure, right? A fresh start." A fresh start. At 68, after 3 decades in the same house, because it would be convenient for him to redecorate. "How long do I have?" I asked. We were thinking end of the month. Chloe found this interior designer who can start in 3 weeks. It was the 15th of January. They were giving me 2 weeks to dismantle my entire life so they could redo my kitchen. "Of course," I said, 2 weeks should be plenty." Ethan beamed like I'd agreed to hand him a gift instead of my whole life. "You're the best, Mom. I knew you'd understand." I watched him leave the kitchen, no doubt to report to Chloe that the difficult conversation had gone smoothly, that I'd been reasonable, that they could move forward without any messy scenes. I stood alone in that kitchen, surrounded by 30 years of memory, and something cold and clear settled into my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, something far more dangerous. Clarity. I texted my neighbor, Patricia Lindgren, that afternoon to cancel our standing yoga plans. Patricia was 72, ran marathons, and had more energy than most people half her age. She'd have laughed in Chloe's face at the idea that 68 was too old for anything besides bingo night. "Rain check," I typed. "I have some research to do." Research was the word I used when I was planning something that required patience and precision, the way I'd once researched the right contractor for our kitchen renovation, or the best rose varieties for our anniversary garden. This time, I opened my laptop and typed something different entirely. Real estate market analysis. Current property values are zip code. Then, how to sell a house fast, best offer. And finally, almost without meaning to, my fingers typed, cost of living, Monaco. That last search surprised even me. Monaco had been a private joke between Walter and me for 30 years, something we'd invent when the bills piled up or the winters felt endless. I could still hear him saying it, propped against the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand. Some February, when the cabinetry business was 3 months behind on payroll and neither of us could remember the last time we'd bought anything that wasn't strictly necessary. When we're rich, he'd say, with that half smile he used whenever he was about to say something he only half believed, we'll have a little place in Monaco. Drink champagne on a terrace. Watch the sunset over the water and never think about a payroll again in our lives. I'd always laughed and told him to finish his coffee and get back to the shop. It had been a fantasy, nothing more, a way of making the hard years feel survivable. But fantasies have a strange way of becoming plans the moment the people who love you decide you're inconvenient. I spent 3 hours reading. Property values in our neighborhood had climbed steadily for years. The house Walter and I had bought for $83,000 in 1989 was now worth well over $400,000, maybe more depending on the market. Monaco was expensive, certainly, but not impossible for a woman with the right assets behind her. And I had more assets than Ethan realized. The house wasn't the only thing Walter left me. There was his life insurance policy. The proceeds from selling the cabinetry business 2 years before he died. 3 decades of careful, quiet investing. Walter had always handled our finances, claiming he liked the research, while I focused on the house and the boy and the garden. I'd trusted him completely, never fully grasping how thoroughly he'd provided for a future he wouldn't live to see. Ethan thought the house was his inheritance. He was wrong about that too. The will had been clear from the start. Everything went to me first and only to him after I was gone. The house transfer had been strictly for tax purposes. Everything else remained mine, all of it. By noon, I had the outline of a plan. By 1, I was on the phone. "Mrs. Halstead," said Paige Donnelly, the agent who'd sold 3 houses on our street in the past year, "I'd be delighted to help. When were you thinking of listing?" "As soon as possible," I said. "I need to move quickly. The market's hot right now, especially for well-kept colonials. When can I come take a look?" "This afternoon." There was a pause on the line. "That's fast. Is everything all right?" "Everything's perfect," I said, and for the first time in months I meant it completely. "I'm ready for an adventure." Paige arrived at 3 sharp, an efficient woman in her 40s with a measuring tape and an eye for craftsmanship. She walked through my house noting crown molding, original hardwood, the updated kitchen, with real professional appreciation. "This is remarkable," she said, standing in the sunlit living room. "You've maintained this beautifully." "Thank you. May I ask, are you downsizing?" "Relocating internationally, actually." Her eyebrows lifted, pleasantly surprised. "How exciting. Where to?" "Monaco." If she thought that was strange, she hit it well. "Lovely. A colleague of mine relocated near Nice a few years back. Mediterranean living, supposed to be wonderful." Living, not retiring. I appreciated that more than she could have known. "What do you think it might sell for?" I asked. She did the math out loud. Given the neighborhood, the condition, and current demand, somewhere between $415,000 and $445,000. Possibly more with multiple offers, which I expect. $445,000. More than 5 times what we'd paid. Enough for a beautiful apartment on the French Riviera with plenty left over for whatever came next. How fast could we close? With the right buyer, 30 days. A cash offer could move even faster. 30 days. My son had given me 2 weeks to vanish quietly into a retirement facility. I was giving myself a month to vanish entirely, just not in the direction he expected. "Let's do it," I said. Paige smiled. "I'll have the paperwork tonight. We could list by Friday if you're comfortable." "Perfect." After she left, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad, making lists, what to keep, what to sell, what to donate, calls to make, accounts to close. It's remarkable how much of a life you can quietly dismantle once you finally decide to. Ethan and Chloe came home around 6 that evening, chattering about their day at the gym, moving through the house like they already owned it, which on paper, they technically did. "How was the house hunting, Mom?" Ethan asked, grabbing a water bottle from the fridge. "Very productive," I said. "I should have news soon." "See, I told you this would work out. Change can be good, right?" "Absolutely," I agreed, and meant every word of it, though not in the way he thought. Change can be exactly what a person needs. That night, I lay in the bed I'd shared with Walter for 25 years, listening to Ethan and Chloe's voices drift up from the living room, planning what furniture they'd buy once I was gone. I wasn't angry yet. That would come, in time, in smaller doses than I expected. What I felt instead was something far more useful. Freedom. For the first time since Walter died, I wasn't afraid of change. I was 68 years old, healthy, financially independent, and about to begin the biggest adventure of my life, and neither of the two people planning my exile downstairs had the faintest idea it was coming. Friday morning came in sharp and clear, the kind of January light that makes everything look like it's been freshly cut out of glass. I stood at my bedroom window and watched Ethan load his golf clubs into his BMW. The same BMW I'd signed for when he graduated business school, while Chloe emerged in yoga clothes that probably cost more than most people's car payments, her ponytail pulled tight enough to qualify as architecture. Golf for him, Pilates and a spa appointment for her. And for me, Paige Donnelly arriving at 10 with a listing agreement that would change everything before either of them made it home for dinner. I dressed carefully that morning, a navy dress Walter had always said brought out my eyes, paired with the pearls he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. If I was going to sign away 30 years of my life, I intended to do it looking like the woman I actually was, underneath the convenient doormat everyone in that house had started mistaking me for. Paige's silver sedan pulled into the driveway at exactly 10. I met her at the door before she could ring the bell. "Mrs. Halstead," she said warmly, "ready to make this official." More ready than I've been for anything in years. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had delivered his ultimatum 2 days earlier, while she walked me through the listing with the patience of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. 435, she said, tapping the number. Based on comps and current demand, I expect multiple offers within the first week. And with a cash buyer, 2 to 3 weeks potentially. Financing would run 4 to 6. She looked up. "Are you certain about this timeline? Most sellers want longer to make arrangements." "I'm certain," I said, signing my name with a flourish that surprised us both. The faster, the better. After she left, I sat alone in the quiet house and tried to imagine Ethan's face when he discovered what I'd done. Furious, certainly. But also, I suspected, deeply confused, because in his version of our story, I was supposed to shuffle gratefully into whatever small kindness he decided to offer me. The idea that I might have my own resources, my own agency, my own timeline, had simply never occurred to him. Not once in 35 years had it occurred to my son that his mother might be more than the person who made his lunches and later, his excuses. I spent the afternoon on the phone, starting with Martin Vance, the financial advisor who'd managed Walter's investments since before I was widowed. Martin said warmly, "How are you holding up?" "Better than I've been in months. Martin, I need to talk through my portfolio. I'm making some big changes." "Of course, when would you like to come in?" "Today, if you can." A pause. "That sounds urgent. Everything all right?" "Everything's perfect. I'm moving to Monaco." The silence lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. "Monaco," he finally repeated, "as in the French Riviera Monaco." "That's the one." "Well," he cleared his throat, "that's certainly a change. Let me rearrange a few things. Can you be here at 3? Martin's office occupied the 11th floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building that makes you feel important just by riding the elevator. I'd been there a dozen times over the years, always beside Walter, always following his lead. That afternoon, I walked in alone, wearing my navy dress and my confidence like a second coat. Martin stood as his assistant showed me in. "You look wonderful. Different somehow." "I feel different," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "Tell me my full financial position, Martin, all of it." For the next hour, he walked me through numbers that made my head spin in the best possible way: Walter's life insurance, the proceeds from the cabinetry business, 3 decades of steady, unglamorous investing. When he finished, I stared at the total on his monitor and felt something like vertigo. 3 million, I said slowly. "Plus whatever the house brings," Martin confirmed. "Walter was smart about money, and very protective of your future." Walter had always handled our finances, insisting he enjoyed the research while I focused on the house and the buy. I'd trusted his judgment completely, never fully realizing how carefully he'd built a floor under me that would still be standing 5 years after he was gone. What would I need to live comfortably in Monaco? I asked. Martin ran some numbers. Depends on your lifestyle, obviously, but a comfortable apartment and reasonable expenses, probably 65,000 to 85,000 a year. Your portfolio could generate that indefinitely without touching the principal. And if I wanted to buy property there? Expensive, but with your assets and the house sale, absolutely doable. A good apartment could run anywhere from $500,000 to several million, depending on location. I thought of the listings I'd been scrolling through all morning. Terraces overlooking the harbor, French doors, marble floors, buildings where no one would ever suggest I needed somewhere more appropriate for a woman my age. Martin, I want to liquidate what needs liquidating and move the rest into accounts I can access internationally. How fast can that happen? He leaned forward, genuinely concerned now. This is an enormous decision. Have you talked to Ethan? Maybe we should. This is my decision, I said, gently but firmly. My money, my life. I don't need anyone's permission to live it. There's one more thing, I said, before he could answer. The house transfer after Walter died. I signed it without reading it carefully. I need to know exactly what I actually gave away and what I didn't. Martin pulled up something on his second monitor, frowning slightly, and reached for the phone on his desk. Give me 20 minutes. I want my colleague Aaron to look at this properly. He handles our estate work, and I'd rather you hear this from someone who reads these documents for a living than from me guessing. Aaron Whitcomb turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 60s who read through the scanned transfer document twice, in silence, while I sat with my hands folded in my lap and tried not to hold my breath. This is a quitclaim deed, he said finally, transferring the property itself into your son's name. That part is real, and it's binding legally as of today. The house is his. But the transfer only covers the real property. It doesn't touch anything else in your husband's estate, the investment accounts, the insurance proceeds, the business sale. Whoever drafted this for your son did the bare minimum, and I'd guess they did it quickly. He looked up at me over his glasses. Mrs. Halstead, did your son ever tell you this document gave him anything beyond the house itself? He implied the house was his inheritance, that the rest would follow the same way, eventually. It wouldn't have. Your will supersedes any of that, and from what Martin's shown me, everything else passes to you first, in full, with your son as beneficiary only after your death. He inherited a house. He did not inherit you, or your money, or the right to decide where you live. Aaron closed the folder gently. I'd also want to flag something else if it's useful to you. A transfer executed within months of a spouse's death, under emotional duress, without independent legal counsel for the transferring party, that's the kind of thing a court can look at skeptically if it ever needed to. I'm not saying you should challenge it. From what you've described, I don't think you need to. I'm only saying you have more legal footing here than your son appears to think you do, and it might be worth knowing that, going forward. I thanked him, and after he left, Martin studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're absolutely right to ask. I apologize for not raising it myself. Old habit, Walter used to make most of these calls. Walter's gone, I said softly. I'm not. We spent another hour on logistics, wire transfers, currency exchange, international banking relationships. By the time I left his office, I had a clear timeline. Within 2 weeks, I could have money waiting for me anywhere in the world. That evening, I cooked dinner for the three of us the way I had every night since Ethan and Chloe had moved in. Chicken piccata, roasted vegetables, one of Ethan's childhood favorites. I set the table with the good china, lit candles, opened a bottle of wine Walter, and I had been saving for something worth celebrating. This is nice, Mom, Ethan said, sitting down. What's the occasion? I wanted to cook for you while I still can, I said, serving him a generous portion. Once I move, we won't have many more dinners like this. Chloe took a small serving of vegetables and ignored the chicken entirely. Have you looked at any places yet? I have, I said, and it was entirely true. The options are quite exciting. See, Ethan said, cutting into his chicken with enthusiasm, I told you this would be good for you. A chance to try something new. Meet people your own age. People your own age. Again, like aging was a contagious condition requiring careful quarantine from anyone still vibrant. I've been thinking about what you said, I continued, refilling their glasses, about needing space to grow as a couple. You're right. Young couples need privacy, room to build their own traditions. Chloe smiled, the first genuine one she'd aimed at me in months. Exactly. Nothing personal, Dee, you're wonderful. We're just at different stages of life. Different stages. As though life were a board game and I'd landed on the retirement home square while they were still collecting new furniture money. I understand completely, I said. In fact, I've already started making arrangements. Ethan looked up surprised. Really? That was fast. You said end of the month. I didn't want to hold up your plans. Mom, you're being so reasonable about this. He reached over and squeezed my hand. I was worried you might be upset. Upset. The word sat between us like a landmine waiting for someone careless enough to step on it. I squeezed his hand back, memorizing the warmth of it, the way his fingers had once curled around mine during thunderstorms when he was small and afraid of the dark. Why would I be upset about an adventure? I asked. After dinner, while they watched television in the living room, I cleaned the kitchen alone and thought about every meal I'd prepared in that space: birthday cakes, holiday feasts, quick breakfasts before school, midnight snacks when Ethan brought friends home from college. The kitchen held more memory than any other room in the house. And I was surprised to realize I felt entirely ready to leave it behind. The first showing came the next morning. Paige had warned me there'd be interest, but even she seemed startled when she called at 8 to schedule 3 appointments for that same afternoon. The market's hotter than I expected, she said. 6 calls since the listing went live. We might want to think about a bidding strategy. Whatever you think best, I said, watching Ethan through the window as he loaded his golf clubs again. Saturday mornings were sacred to him, had been since college. Some habits, apparently, were worth preserving no matter what else in a family fell apart. I spent the morning boxing up the hallway photographs, 30 years of them. Ethan's school pictures, Walter's business awards, vacation snapshots from years when money was tight but our dreams weren't. Each one told a story, and together they told the story of a life well built, even if it was ending in a way I'd never expected it to. The doorbell rang at noon. Patricia stood on my porch holding a bottle of wine and an expression of barely contained curiosity. All right, she said, following me into the kitchen. Paige Donnelly's car in your driveway, a for sale sign going up Monday, and you looking like the cat that ate the canary. Talk. I poured 2 glasses and told her everything, the ultimatum, Chloe's vanity speech, my decision to sell and move to Monaco. Patricia listened without interrupting once, her expression sliding from surprise to delight to something close to awe. Monaco, she repeated when I finished. You're actually doing it. I'm actually doing it. What about Ethan? What will you tell him? I considered the question honestly, turning my glass by the stem. Eventually, he's going to be furious. He's going to be a lot of things, she agreed, but that's not your problem anymore. She raised her glass to Diane Halstead, who's finally figured out it's not too late to choose herself. The first couple came through at 2, young, a baby on the mother's hip, admiring the original hardwood and the updated kitchen with something close to reverence. The second was an investor, clinical and polite, measuring square footage instead of memory. The third arrived just as the light was turning gold, an older couple who moved through my house the way Walter and I once had, with wonder, with possibility. The garden is extraordinary, the woman said, looking out at the beds I'd tended for 3 decades. You can see the care in every detail. Someone loved this house, her husband agreed, running a hand along the banister Walter had refinished by hand. You can feel it. I knew, watching them, that they'd be the ones, not just because Paige assured me they were qualified, but because they would love the house the way it deserved to be loved. That night, alone in my bedroom with my laptop, I researched Monaco apartments with the focus of a woman who'd finally been given permission to want something for herself. Terraces facing the sea. French doors, marble floors, buildings with concierge service and rooftop gardens. One listing caught and held me. A fourth-floor apartment near the harbor with a wraparound terrace, views of both the water and the palace, available immediately. I was reaching for my phone when I heard voices drifting up through the heating vent from the kitchen below. "Perfect timing," Ethan was saying. "She's being so cooperative. I was worried she'd make a whole scene." "You know how emotional older women can get about change," Chloe replied. Emotional older women. I set down my phone and moved closer to the vent, my cheeks burning. "She's always been reasonable," Ethan said. "Dad used to say she was the most practical woman he ever met. She'll be fine once she settles somewhere appropriate." Appropriate. The word that had chased me through an entire week, that had sent me straight into international banking and Mediterranean real estate listings. "I just can't wait to have our own space," Chloe went on. "I've already started looking at furniture. That whole farmhouse thing is so outdated. Something more modern. Clean lines." Clean lines. She wanted to erase every trace of the life Walter and I had built here and replace it with something that looked like a catalog. "Whatever you want, babe," Ethan said. "It's our house now." Our house now. The words landed like a physical blow, not because they were legally untrue, but because of how easily he'd waved away 35 years of my life to say them. I sat back down at the laptop, the Monaco apartment still glowing on the screen, promising a place where no one would ever call me emotional for objecting to my own erasure. I picked up my phone and dialed the international number on the rental listing. It was the middle of the night there, but the call routed to a service promising a callback within 24 hours. "This is Diane Halstead," I said into the recording. "I'm calling about the apartment on Avenue des Citronniers. I'd like a virtual tour as soon as possible. I'm prepared to wire the first month's rent and deposit immediately upon approval." I hung up and stared at my phone, my heart beating fast with something that felt, unmistakably, like joy. Downstairs, Ethan and Chloe kept planning their takeover of my life, paint colors, furniture, all the ways they intended to improve upon everything Walter and I had built. Let them plan. Let them dream. Let them keep assuming I'd disappear quietly into whatever corner they'd chosen for me. They were about to learn that Diane Halstead had plans of her own. Sunday brought the season's first real snowfall, dusting the garden I'd tended for 30 years in a blanket of white that made everything look new again. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching Ethan shovel the driveway with the same methodical precision he'd inherited from his father. He was a good man in a lot of ways, I reminded myself. Kind to animals, generous with his friends, smart about business most days. But somewhere in the last few years, he'd learned to see me as an obligation instead of a person, a problem to manage instead of a mother to cherish. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when that shift had happened. I only knew I had no interest in spending whatever years I had left trying to earn back his respect. My phone rang as I finished my second cup, an international number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Halstead." The voice was female, French accented, crisp with the particular precision of someone educated in 3 languages. "This is Margaret Laurent from Riviera Properties. You called about the apartment on Avenue des Citronniers." "Yes," I said, pulse quickening. "Thank you for calling back so quickly." "Of course. Your timing is excellent. If I'm honest, most people prefer to relocate to Monaco in the spring or summer, so interest has been quiet this time of year." "I'm not most people," I said. Margaret laughed, warm and immediate. "I can arrange a virtual tour this afternoon, if you're available. The apartment is furnished, quite elegant. May I ask what brings you to Monaco in winter?" I looked out at Ethan, still shoveling with determined strokes, and smiled to myself. A fresh start. The virtual tour that afternoon was everything I'd hoped for and more. Margaret walked me through the apartment with her phone, rooms flooded with natural light, a terrace with views that stopped my breath, a compact but elegant kitchen, a breakfast nook overlooking the harbor. "The building has a concierge," she explained. "Walking distance to the casino, the palace, wonderful restaurants. Very safe, very quiet." "It's perfect," I said and meant it. "What do I need to secure it?" "First month's rent, a security deposit, and proof of financial stability, given that you're international." I can have that to you by tomorrow morning. Wonderful, when would you like to take possession? I thought about the deadline Ethan had handed me, end of the month, before Chloe's designer started work. February 1st, if possible. Absolutely possible. I'll prepare the lease immediately. After we hung up, I sat staring at the photos Margaret had texted me, my kitchen, my terrace, my next life waiting for me on the French Riviera like a gift I'd never let myself imagine. That evening we had dinner as a family one final time. I made pot roast, another of Ethan's favorites, and we talked about safe, forgettable things, the weather, the news, Chloe's latest certification program. Mom, Ethan said as I cleared the dessert plates, I've been thinking, maybe we should go look at some places together next week. Make sure you find somewhere nice. I paused, plates in hand, looking down at my son's face. He was trying, in his limited way, to be kind, trying to soften whatever guilt he felt about displacing me by helping me pick out a suitable replacement for the life he was taking away. That's sweet of you, I said, but I've already found somewhere perfect. Really? Where? It's a surprise, I said, carrying the plates to the sink. I think you'll be very surprised by my choice. Monday brought the call I'd been waiting for. Paige Donnelly, her voice bright with excitement. Dee, we have 3 offers, all above asking. Tell me. The young couple with the baby came in at $425,000. The investor went to $438,000. And then there's the Whitlocks, Grace and Daniel. They offered $458,000 with a personal letter. Read it to me, I said, and Paige did over the phone, standing I imagined in her own office with the letter in one hand. 2 pages describing a young family who'd been priced out of 3 other neighborhoods that year, who'd stood in my kitchen and both, independently, without discussing it with each other first, thought of their own grandmothers. Grace had grown up 2 towns over and remembered walking past colonials just like mine as a girl, promising herself that one day she'd have a garden worth walking past. Daniel wrote that he'd noticed the growth marks penciled into the pantry door frame, Ethan's, from 25 years earlier, faint now but never painted over, and hoped, if they were lucky enough to be chosen, that the sellers wouldn't mind if they simply kept adding to them rather than sanding them away. I hadn't cried once through the entire ordeal with Ethan and Chloe. I cried a little over that letter, sitting alone at my kitchen table, and I think that's when I knew, with total certainty, exactly who deserved to live inside the walls that had raised my son. $458,000. Nearly twice what Ethan believed the house was worth. Enough to buy my Monaco apartment outright, with plenty left over for whatever came next. The Whitlocks, I said without hesitation. I was hoping you'd say that. They seem like the kind of people who will actually love this house. When can we close? They're offering cash, no contingencies. 2 weeks if you're ready. 2 weeks. The exact timeline Ethan had given me to find somewhere appropriate for a woman my age. Let's do it. Paige had the sign in my yard by 4 that afternoon. She believed in momentum, she told me, and I was starting to believe in it too. I should have known it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Nothing does in a neighborhood where everyone plays golf with everyone else's husband. Ethan came home Tuesday evening already furious, before I'd said a single word to him about any of it. Do you want to explain, he said, dropping his gym bag in the front hall hard enough that it skidded, why Doug Halloran asked me at the club today if we were having money troubles. Why there's a for sale sign standing in our front yard that I had to hear about from a guy I play golf with. I was going to tell you both this week, I said, which was true, though not quite in the way he meant it. Tell me what? That you're selling my house without even talking to me first. I'm selling my house, I said. And I don't recall you talking to me first, either, about redecorating it, or about which senior facility I'd be touring on Monday. That landed somewhere underneath his anger, but it didn't slow him down. This is insane, Mom. Do you have any idea how this looks? I told people at work you were thinking about downsizing, that it was your idea, that everything was fine. Now half the neighborhood thinks I put my own mother's house on the market behind her back, and the other half thinks you've lost your mind and I'm not doing anything about it. Either way, I look like garbage. I want you to notice, because I certainly did, standing in that front hall, not one word out of my son's mouth that evening was about me. Not "Are you all right?" Not "Why did you feel like you could tell me?" Only what the sign in the yard was doing to how he looked at the club. To a story he'd apparently already told his coworkers to keep himself comfortable while he waited out my 2 weeks. "I'm not asking your permission, Ethan," I said quietly. "I'm telling you as a courtesy that I've made a decision about my own life." "You can't just—" He stopped, recalibrating, and I watched him reach for a different tool entirely, the way he always had whenever charm stopped working on me. "Fine. Fine, you want to sell, that's your right, I guess. But I want a real estate attorney to look at this before anything closes. Trevor Ackley from the gym, he handles this stuff. Just to make sure everything's being done properly. For your protection." "For my protection," I repeated. "You've been under a lot of stress since Dad died. I just want to make sure nobody's taking advantage of you. This Paige woman, this whole thing happening so fast, it doesn't look right, Mom." I felt something cold slide into place behind my ribs, a feeling I'd remember later as the exact moment I understood my son might actually try to stop me, not out of love, but because a version of me making my own decisions quickly and confidently didn't fit the story he needed people to believe about himself. "Have your friend send whatever letter he wants," I said. "I have nothing to hide, Ethan. I'd suggest you make sure you don't either." He didn't have an answer for that. He went upstairs without saying goodnight. The very next morning, before I'd even had a chance to see whether the threat would amount to anything, I went down to the basement to find the box of sheet music I wanted to bring for my Monaco students, whoever they turned out to be, and found the far wall bare. Walter's workbench was gone. His table saw, his hand planes, the pegboard of chisels he'd kept sharp his entire life, all of it gone, along with 3 boxes of my old craft supplies I hadn't touched in years but had never once considered throwing away. I found Ethan in the kitchen and asked him, as calmly as I could manage, where his father's tools had gone. "I had a junk guy come take the clutter out of the basement," he said, not even looking up from his phone. "It's not like you were using any of it, Mom, and the guy said Dad's old workbench wasn't worth anything anyway. I figured it'd save you the trouble since you're supposedly moving somewhere smaller." "Those were your father's." "They were just tools," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice told me he genuinely believed that 20 years of watching his father sand and plane and build things with his own 2 hands had somehow left no impression on him deeper than clutter. I didn't think it would be a big deal. "It's not like you were going to want a table saw in an apartment overseas." I didn't argue with him. There wasn't a version of that argument I could win with a man who'd already decided the contents of his father's life were disposable the moment they stopped being convenient to look at. I simply thanked him for confirming, more clearly than anything else he'd done in 18 months, exactly how little he understood about what actually mattered in the house he thought he already owned. I called the junk removal company myself that evening, gave them a number well above whatever they'd paid Ethan for the lot, and asked if anything had sold yet. Most of it hadn't. I bought back Walter's workbench and his good chisels for $400, and I didn't tell my son I'd done it. Some things, I decided, he simply didn't get to know I'd saved. 2 days after that, a letter arrived not to me, but to Paige's brokerage and, I'd learned from Martin, to the title company handling the closing, raising vague, lawyerly concerns about the seller's independent capacity and the accelerated nature of the transaction, and requesting a delay pending review. It was nothing, legally. Aaron Whitcomb read it over the phone and laughed, actually laughed, before telling me not to worry, that a letter like that from a golf buddy with a law degree carried exactly as much weight as the paper it was printed on, and that he'd have a response filed within a day or 2. But nothing, legally still meant a stretch of not knowing for certain whether the title company would get nervous and slow the closing regardless. Days of watching the calendar with my flight already booked for the 31st, wondering whether patience and paperwork would actually be enough, or whether my son had found, almost by accident, the one lever that might still work. It worked out. Aaron's response went out clean and unambiguous, and the title company confirmed within hours that closing would proceed as scheduled. But I want you to sit with that stretch of uncertainty for a moment, because I certainly had to. Even with $2 million in the bank and a lawyer on retainer, even at 68, and clear-headed and entirely within my rights. It took exactly one letter from an entitled young man with the right vocabulary to make me understand how easily any of this still could have gone sideways, and how many women in my position wouldn't have had an Aaron Whitcomb to call. I didn't tell Ethan any of that. I let him believe, for the moment, that his letter had simply vanished into the machinery of a closing he no longer had any say in. I was saving the rest of it for a morning he wouldn't see coming. The rest of that week brought its own flurry of ordinary logistics besides all of it: closing documents, moving estimates, flight reservations. I was startled by how quickly a life could be dismantled once you finally put your mind to it. How many phone calls it took to unroot 30 years of habit, even with a lawyer's letter and an empty basement wall complicating every step of it. Later that week, I drove to the shelter for what I hadn't yet told anyone would be my last Tuesday walk. Renata Choi, the director, met me at the intake desk with a leash already in her hand for Bruno, a lumbering shepherd mix I'd been walking every week for 8 months. The kind of dog nobody adopts because he's big and gray, muzzled and unremarkable in every way, except the way he leaned his whole weight against your leg the moment you sat down beside him. We walked the loop behind the shelter in silence for a while, Bruno stopping to investigate the same 3 trees he investigated every week, and I found I didn't have the words yet to tell her what I'd decided. It was Renata who finally noticed something was different. "You're quiet today," she said. "Quieter than usual, I mean." "I'm relocating," I told her, and once I'd said it out loud to someone besides Patricia, it became real in a new way. "Internationally. I'm afraid this is my last Tuesday." Renata stopped walking. "Where on earth?" "Monaco." She stared at me for a long moment, and Bruno, sensing the pause, sat down heavily on both our feet. "Diane, did you win the lottery?" "Something like that," I said, smiling, though the truth was closer to my son tried to evict me and accidentally handed me my freedom. "Well," she crouched down to scratch behind Bruno's ears, not quite looking at me. "I'm happy for you, genuinely, but I want you to know you've been one of the most dedicated volunteers this place has ever had. Bruno's going to notice you're gone before half the staff does." Dedicated? The word followed me home and sat with me the rest of the evening. I'd been dedicated to a great many things over the years: my marriage, my son, my house, my community. I had never once, not fully, been dedicated to myself, to my own happiness, my own dreams. That was about to change, and the last piece of proof of it came 2 days later, in my own sunroom, with 11 children and their parents crowded onto folding chairs I'd borrowed from the church down the road. I hadn't planned a farewell recital. I'd simply told each family, one by one, that I was relocating and wouldn't be able to continue lessons, and by the second phone call, someone had already suggested the students play one last time together before I left. Lucy Abernathy played her chop-in prelude without a single rushed note. A boy named Miles Trout, who'd cried through his first 6 months of lessons and now played with a seriousness that made his mother tear up in the back row, worked through a Clementi sonatina he'd been practicing since October. When it was over, the parents lingered longer than they needed to, thanking me in ways that had nothing to do with piano, for patience, for consistency, for being, as one father put it, the most reliable hour of the week in a house that doesn't have a lot of reliable hours. I hadn't realized, until that afternoon, how much quiet evidence I'd built over the years of exactly who I was, entirely apart from being anyone's mother or anyone's inconvenience. It made what was coming easier to bear, and harder both at once. A few nights later, Ethan and Chloe came home to find me in the living room with my laptop and a glass of wine, researching flights to Nice. "Working on something interesting?" Ethan asked, settling into the armchair that had been his father's favorite spot. "Travel arrangements," I said, which was entirely true. "For visiting Sunrise Meadow. Smart, getting familiar with the area." I looked at my son, really looked at him, trying to memorize his face before everything between us changed for good. He was handsome the way Walter had been handsome at that age, kind eyes and an easy smile, but there was an entitlement underneath it now, a casual assumption that the world would keep arranging itself around his convenience. "Something like that," I said. The closing came 2 days after that. I sat in a conference room with Grace and Daniel Whitlock, Paige, 2 attorneys, and a stack of paper that would transfer ownership of my life to 2 strangers who promised to love it well. Grace had tears in her eyes as she signed the final page. "We'll take such good care of it," she told me, "the garden especially. I can see how much love went into every inch." "I know you will," I said, and I meant it completely. The house would be a home again to someone, instead of a showcase for someone else's idea of clean lines. When it was over, I held a cashier's check for $458,000 minus Paige's commission, more money than I'd ever physically held in my hands. Enough to buy freedom in any currency. "What will you do now?" Grace asked as we walked out together. "Start over," I said, "at 68, completely over." "That's exciting," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I hope I have your courage when I'm your age." Your age? This time, the phrase didn't sting at all. This time it sounded like a badge of honor. That night, I cooked one last meal in my own kitchen, nothing fancy, just eggs and toast, and I savored every bite. By tomorrow, Ethan and Chloe would return from their weekend getaway to find the house sold, my room empty, and a letter on the counter explaining everything they thought they knew about me was wrong. I was packed and ready to discover who I actually was. The moving truck arrived at 7 the following morning, its diesel engine rumbling through the quiet street like a mechanical herald of everything about to change. I stood at my bedroom window, dressed for travel, watching a crew of 3 men prepare to load the carefully chosen pieces of my life, bound for a storage facility 3,000 miles away. Ethan and Chloe were still asleep, having come home late the night before from a weekend at a spa resort in Vermont, texting sporadic photos of couples' massages while I quietly finished dismantling the life they assumed would wait patiently for their return. While they'd been celebrating their future in my house, I'd been securing my own future an ocean away, and the irony wasn't lost on me for a single second. I met the movers at the door, directing them to the pieces I'd marked with yellow tape, my grandmother's china cabinet, a few boxes of books, the oil painting Walter had commissioned for our 25th anniversary. A landscape of the lake where we'd spent our honeymoon. "That everything, ma'am?" asked the crew chief, a weathered man named Gus who moved with the efficiency of someone who'd packed up hundreds of other people's lives. "That's everything," I confirmed, signing papers that would send my belongings by ship to France while I flew ahead to receive them. After the truck pulled away, the house felt lighter somehow, as if it too were ready to move on to its next chapter. I walked through the emptied rooms, footsteps echoing on floors I'd polished one final time the night before. Upstairs, the shower ran. Chloe, beginning her morning routine, still unaware that anything had changed. They'd been so certain of my compliance that it hadn't occurred to either of them to question the missing furniture, the absence of Sunrise Meadow brochures scattered across the counters. The shower stopped. Footsteps on the stairs announced Chloe's descent, and I heard her pause, probably noticing the missing coffee table, the empty spot where my grandmother's china cabinet had stood for 25 years. "Dee," her voice carried a note of confusion. "Did you move some furniture?" "Just some rearranging," I called back, which wasn't technically a lie. I had, in fact, rearranged some things from this house to a cargo ship to a storage facility in Nice. Geography, I'd decided, was simply another form of interior design. Ethan appeared a few minutes later in pajama pants and a frown. "Mom, where's all your stuff?" "Gone," I said simply. "Gone where?" "To my new place." He blinked at me. "You haven't moved yet. We said end of the month, today's the 31st. "You're right," I said, standing and smoothing my traveling dress. "Today is the 31st, and I'm leaving for my new place this afternoon." Chloe materialized beside him, her face cycling from confusion to alarm. "Leaving? We're supposed to tour Sunrise Meadow on Monday." "No," I corrected gently. "You assumed I'd tour Sunrise Meadow on Monday. I never agreed to that." Ethan's expression ran through confusion, realization, anger, and back to confusion, like a slot machine that couldn't settle on a combination. "Mom, what's going on? Where are your things? Where are you going?" I walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd left 2 envelopes the night before, each addressed in my own careful handwriting. I handed them over and sat back down in the one chair I'd left behind, a wingback that had never been comfortable but had carried too much sentiment for me to sell. Walter used to read his evening paper in it. Ethan had opened Christmas presents in front of it for 20 years. Everything you need to know is in there, I said, but the short version is this: you told me to find my own place. I did. Where? Chloe demanded, tearing at her envelope. Monaco. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the hallway clock ticking away the seconds of their shock. Chloe read fastest, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. 3 million, Ethan read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Plus the house sale, I confirmed. 458,000 after commission. The Whitlocks are lovely people. They're planning to restore the garden to its full glory. You sold the house, Chloe said, going pale beneath her makeup. This house. Closed yesterday, right on schedule despite Trevor's letter. Ethan went very still. How do you know about that? Because your friend sent it to my title company, not to the moon, Ethan. Aaron Whitcomb had it answered by Thursday morning. I'd have thought Trevor might mention that part when he billed you for it. I let that sit a moment, watching something in my son's face crumble in a way it hadn't yet that whole conversation, not shock this time, but the specific humiliation of realizing his one attempt to actually stop me had failed so quietly he hadn't even known to be embarrassed about it yet. You tried to have me declared unreliable with my own real estate agent, Ethan. I'd have appreciated it if you'd at least had the nerve to say that to my face instead of hiring someone to say it for you. That's not, I was trying to protect you. You were trying to protect the story you'd already told your friends at the club, I said. There's a difference, and we both know it. You can't do that, he said again, weaker now, grasping for the only ground he had left. It's my inheritance. It's in my name. Dad wanted me to have it. Dad wanted a lot of things, I said. He wanted me safe and provided for and treated the way he treated me for 41 years. I don't think he wanted his son handing his widow a 2-week deadline to disappear into a facility she never chose. And as for the house, I paused, letting the next part land the way Aaron Whitcomb had let it land with me. The transfer only ever covered the property itself. It never touched a dollar of the rest of what your father left me, no matter what you assumed it did. And it was signed under circumstances a court wouldn't look at kindly if it ever came to that. It didn't come to that, Ethan. I didn't need a court. I only needed a calendar and a plane ticket. He stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. But where will we live? It was exactly the question I'd expected, and exactly the one that revealed everything wrong with the last 18 months. Not how will you manage, not are you all right. Only, where would they live now that the free housing was gone? I'm sure you'll figure something out, I said kindly. You're both capable adults with good jobs and excellent credit. You'll be fine. Fine, Chloe's voice cracked. D, you can't leave us homeless. We don't have a down payment saved. Not with the market the way it is. You've been saving, I repeated slowly. For what exactly? They exchanged a glance that told me everything. They'd been saving for their own future while living rent-free in my house, eating food I'd bought, treating me like a landlord who happened not to charge rent, while planning, the whole time, to evict that same landlord for their own convenience. This is insane, Ethan said, standing and beginning to pace. You can't move to Monaco. You don't speak French. You don't know anyone there. I'll learn French, I said. I'll meet people. And if something happens to me, at least it will happen while I'm living my life, instead of waiting to die somewhere you picked out for me. We never said anything about waiting to die, Chloe protested. Sunrise Meadow is lovely. They have activities, trips to the theater. Organized fun, I said, for people whose families have decided they're too old for real fun. No, thank you. Ethan stopped pacing and turned to face me, and I recognized, in his expression, the same manipulative sincerity he'd perfected as a teenager, whenever he wanted something badly enough to lie about wanting it. Mom, please, let's talk about this rationally. Monaco is expensive, foreign. What if you hate it? What if you want to come home? This isn't my home anymore, I said quietly. You made that very clear. You scheduled a designer to redecorate before I'd even moved out. I stood, meeting his eyes directly. Ethan, you evicted me from my own life. Did you honestly think I'd go quietly? Chloe was scrolling through her phone now, frantic, no doubt calculating rental costs, trying to understand how quickly their comfortable arrangement had turned expensive and complicated. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded, tears of fury standing in her eyes. "We trusted you. We made plans based on having this house." "You made plans based on having my house," I corrected. "Plans that involved discarding me like furniture that no longer matched the decor. Did you really think I'd cooperate with my own erasure?" Ethan sank into the wingback, his face in his hands. "This is unbelievable. My own mother leaving me homeless. Your own mother who sacrificed everything to give you a good life, who paid for your college, who co-signed your first car and your BMW. Your own mother who you told to find somewhere more appropriate for someone her age." My voice grew stronger with every sentence, 35 years of swallowed frustration finally finding its footing. "We didn't mean it like that." "Yes," I said, "you did." I walked to the window, looking out at the garden where I'd planted bulbs that would bloom in spring for someone else to enjoy. "You meant exactly that. I was too old, too much trouble for your elegant new life." "Well, congratulations. Problem solved." My taxi would arrive in 20 minutes. My bags were already loaded, 2 suitcases holding everything I needed to start over on another continent. "Where will we go?" Chloe whispered, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely frightened. "I'm sure you'll think of something," I said. "Young couples are resourceful. Maybe your parents will take you in while you find something you can afford." "My parents' guest room," Chloe said, her voice climbing an octave. "It's temporary," I said, "just until you find your own place, somewhere more appropriate for people your age." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in that kitchen, and they clearly didn't enjoy how it felt reflected back at them. "Mom, please," Ethan said, standing again. "Don't do this. We can work something out. You can stay. We'll find somewhere else to live." It was the first time in months he'd asked me to stay instead of telling me to leave. But it came from panic, not love, and I'd spent too many years accepting scraps of affection from people who should have been giving me the whole meal. "Ethan," I said gently, "do you remember what you said the week your father died? That you'd always take care of me, that family was everything." His face crumpled. "I remember." "So do I, every word. For 5 years I believed you meant it. I trusted you with my future, my security, and the moment it became inconvenient, you tried to throw it away." "We didn't throw you away. You told me to find my own place, so I did." A car horn sounded outside, right on schedule. "That's my ride." "Mom, wait." Ethan followed me to the front door, his voice breaking. "Please, not like this." I turned to look at him one last time, trying to see past the panic to the little boy who used to tell me I was his best friend in the whole world. "I love you, Ethan," I said. "I will always love you, but I won't let you treat me like a burden anymore. I raised you to be better than that." "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "I believe you are," I said, "but sorry doesn't undo months of planning my own disposal. Sorry doesn't erase the feeling of being unwanted in my own home." Chloe appeared behind him, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Dee, please, we'll do better, we'll change." "You'll change because you have to now," I said, "because your free ride is over. But I'm not interested in being a lesson in gratitude. I'm interested in being happy." I stepped out onto the porch I'd swept every weekend for 30 years. The taxi driver was already out of her car, helping with my bags, a kind-faced woman about my own age. "Airport?" she asked. "Airport," I confirmed. "International terminal." Behind me, Ethan and Chloe murmured in urgent, panicked whispers, probably searching for some legal or emotional lever that might stop me. There wasn't one. I was 68 years old, mentally competent, financially independent, and legally free to live wherever I chose. The fact that my choice inconvenienced them was unfortunate. It was also entirely beside the point. "Ready?" the driver asked, holding the door. I took one last look at the house where I'd been happy for 30 years and miserable for the last 18 months. The Whitlocks would fill it with new love, new laughter, new memory. Ethan and Chloe would find somewhere else to live, and, I hoped, learn to value what they'd had instead of assuming it would always be there. "Ready," I said, and climbed into the car. As we pulled away from the curb, I caught Ethan in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway of what used to be my house, his shoulders shaking with something that might have been tears, or rage, or plain disbelief. Chloe was already on her phone, probably calling her parents to negotiate emergency housing. I felt a flicker of sadness for the pain I was causing them. But it was a clean sadness, uncomplicated by guilt, because they had built this situation with their own entitlement and their own casual cruelty. I was simply declining to be the person who absorbed the cost of it. "Big trip?" the driver asked as we merged onto the highway toward the airport. "New life," I said. "Good for you," she said, catching my eye in the mirror. "Sometimes you've got to shake things up, even when people don't like it." Especially when people don't like it, I thought, but I kept that particular observation to myself. The airport was busy for a weekday afternoon, full of travelers with their own destinations, their own reasons for leaving one place to find another. I checked in for my flight to Nice, handed over my passport like a woman who'd done this 100 times before, and made my way through security with the calm of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. At the gate, I called Patricia to let her know I'd made it that far. "How did they take it?" she asked. "About as well as you'd expect. Shock, anger, disbelief, panic, and a lot of questions about where they're going to live now." "Good," Patricia said firmly. "Let them figure it out. Maybe they'll learn some appreciation." "Maybe. Are you second-guessing anything?" I looked around the gate at families saying goodbye, business travelers hunched over laptops, young couples planning adventures together, everyone going somewhere. Everyone carrying the quiet assumption that the world would arrange itself around their needs. "No second thoughts," I said, "only first thoughts about what comes next." "I'm proud of you, Diane Halstead." "I'm proud of me too." After we hung up, I checked my email. A message from Margaret with final arrival instructions. A note from Martin confirming the international wires had gone through. An automated notice that my credit cards had been activated for international use. Everything was in place, everything was ready, I was ready. Boarding was called at 4. Row 2A. First class, window seat, another small rebellion against the idea that a woman my age should be grateful for whatever accommodation she was handed. As the plane lifted off the runway, I pressed my forehead to the glass and watched my old life shrink into a geometric pattern of roads and rooftops, and tiny cars carrying people to their own destinations. Somewhere down there, Ethan and Chloe were probably still arguing about what to do next, still trying to process the fact that their convenient arrangement had simply vanished into thin air. That was their problem now. I had my own life to begin, my own future to discover, in a place where no one knew anything about me except that I'd been brave enough to start over. A flight attendant appeared with champagne, offering a crystal flute that caught the afternoon light like liquid gold. Celebrating something special. "Freedom," I said, accepting the glass. "I'm celebrating freedom." 8 hours later, the plane began its descent into Nice, and I got my first glimpse of the Mediterranean coastline in the early morning light, impossibly blue, dotted with white boats that looked like toys from that height, the coast curving like something out of a painting, all red roofs and green hills and beaches that promised warmth even in February. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said the businessman beside me, waking from most of the flight. "It's perfect," I said, and meant it completely. The airport was smaller than I expected, quieter, more efficient than what I was used to at home. My passport was stamped with a kind of courtesy that felt distinctly European. My luggage arrived without drama, and within an hour of landing, I was in a taxi heading east along the coast toward Monaco. The drive felt like something out of a film, winding roads hugging the coastline, the view changing with every curve, hillside towns that looked painted by an artist with an unlimited imagination. My driver, a cheerful man named Matthew, kept up a steady commentary in accented English. "First time in Monaco." "First time almost anywhere, really. I've never traveled much." "Ah, but Monaco is a good place to start. Very international, very beautiful. You will love it, I think." As we crested the final hill and Monaco spread out below us, I understood he was right. The harbor was crowded with yachts that looked like floating palaces, their white hulls gleaming. The buildings climbed the hillside in terraces of cream and gold, and the whole city sparkled like a jewelry box left open to catch the light. "Where are you staying?" I gave him the address on Avenue des Citronniers, and he nodded approvingly. "Very nice location. Close to everything, but quiet. Good choice." The building was exactly as beautiful as it had looked in Margot's photographs. Belle Epoque architecture, wrought iron balconies, tall windows that promised light and air and views that would never grow old. The concierge was waiting with my keys and a smile that felt genuinely welcoming. "Madame Halstead," he said in excellent English. "Welcome to Monaco. I am Louis. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Louis. Your apartment is on the 4th floor. I trust you'll be very comfortable." The elevator was small and elegant, brass fixtures and mirrors that belonged in a palace. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, I stepped into a hallway of marble and crystal sconces, and when I unlocked apartment 4B, I stepped into a life I'd never let myself fully imagine. Morning light flooded through floor-to-ceiling windows. The furniture was elegant but livable, antiques mixed with modern pieces in cream and gold and soft blue. And then the terrace. I walked through the French doors onto a wraparound balcony offering a panoramic view of the sea, deep blue and glittering, the harbor already coming to life below. I stood there a long time, breathing air that tasted like salt and possibility, listening to a city wake up in a language I didn't yet speak, but suddenly wanted to learn. My phone buzzed. "Mom, please call. We need to talk." I read Ethan's message twice, then deleted it without answering. We'd already had our talk. He told me what he thought of my place in their lives, and I'd responded accordingly. Whatever he needed to say now could wait until I was ready to hear it, if that day ever came. Instead, I called Margot to tell her I'd arrived safely. "Welcome to Monaco, Madame Halstead," she said. "How do you find the apartment?" "It's perfect, absolutely perfect." "I am so pleased. And please call anytime, restaurant recommendations, shopping, anything at all." "Thank you, I think I'm going to love it here." "I think so too," Margot said. "You've chosen a wonderful place for a new beginning." A new beginning. At 68, when most people were supposedly settling into rocking chairs and early dinners, I was starting the greatest adventure of my life in one of the most beautiful places on earth. Ethan had told me to find my own place, and I had, somewhere no one would ever again suggest I needed something more appropriate for a woman my age. The first week was a blur of small, satisfying logistics, the kind of tasks that would have felt overwhelming a year earlier and instead felt, in that particular moment, like proof of life. Louis walked me 2 streets over to a bank where a patient young manager named Camille helped me open an account in halting French and even more halting English, both of us laughing when I mispronounced my own new address twice in a row. I registered with a doctor. I found a market stall that sold basil that smelled almost exactly like the basil I'd grown for 20 years on a windowsill 3,000 miles away, and I bought a bundle of it simply to keep on my new counter, a small, stubborn thread between my 2 lives. "You are settling in quickly," Louis told me, the 3rd time he caught me coming through the lobby with market bags. "Most people take months before Monaco feels like anything but a postcard." "I've been waiting a long time to feel settled somewhere," I told him. "I think that's why it isn't taking very long." I unpacked the little I'd brought, set my grandmother's photograph on the antique writing desk, and made my first cup of coffee in a kitchen that was entirely mine. Then I carried it out to the terrace and watched the sun climb higher over water I'd never seen before in colors I didn't have names for yet. "To new beginnings," I said aloud, and somewhere in the distance a gull cried back, as if the whole Mediterranean were welcoming me home. 3 weeks into my new life, I learned exactly how far my son was still willing to go to protect his own version of events, even from 3,000 miles away. It started with a knock at my door on a Tuesday morning, not Louis, but a young man from the American consulate in Nice, polite and visibly uncomfortable. Holding a clipboard he seemed to wish he'd left in the car. "Mrs. Halstead? I'm sorry to bother you. We received a welfare inquiry regarding a U.S. citizen at this address, a report that an elderly woman may have recently liquidated significant assets and relocated abroad under possibly coercive or exploitative circumstances. I'm required to conduct a brief in-person check." I stood in my own doorway, in my own robe, holding a cup of coffee I'd made in my own kitchen, and understood immediately, with a clarity that felt almost funny, exactly who'd made that call. "My son," I said, "Ethan Halstead." The young man's face did something careful and diplomatic. "I'm not able to confirm the source of the report, ma'am." "You don't need to." I raised him. I invited him in anyway, made him a cup of coffee he didn't finish, and spent 40 minutes answering questions about my finances, my mental state, my reasons for moving, my relationships with the people around me. Questions I answered plainly, patiently, the way you'd answer any reasonable question from a stranger doing an unpleasant job. I gave him Martin's number and Aaron Whitcomb's, gave him Margot's and Louia's, gave him Margox's number upstairs, in case he wanted to speak to a neighbor who'd actually met me. He left apologetic and satisfied, and I never heard from the consulate again. But I sat on my terrace for a long time after he'd gone, coffee going cold. Turning something over that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a kind of exhausted clarity. My son hadn't called to check if I was happy. He hadn't called to check if I was safe. Not really. If he had, he'd have simply called me. He'd filed a report with a government office, quietly, from a safe distance. The exact same instinct that had made him tell his co-workers I was downsizing instead of admitting he'd handed his mother a 2-week eviction notice. Even here, even after everything, my well-being was still, first and always, a story he needed to be able to tell about himself. I didn't mention it to him when he finally called for real, weeks later. I decided, sitting on that terrace, that I'd let him be the one to bring it up if he ever found the courage. He never did. I've wondered since whether some part of him was ashamed enough of that particular call that he simply hoped I'd never find out who'd made it. I let him keep wondering. 3 months into my new life, I woke to gulls and the gentle slap of water against the harbor wall 4 stories below. Morning light came through gauzy curtains onto herringbone floors that had already become as familiar to me as breathing. My French was improving, slowly and stubbornly. What began as apologetic pointing had turned into actual conversation, with shopkeepers, with waiters, with the neighbors in my building. The language hadn't come easily. I mangled tenses constantly, but the effort brought its own quiet reward, an unfamiliar sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. Margox Feldman, from apartment 3A, had more or less adopted me. A retired philosophy professor who spoke 5 languages and made the most extraordinary hot chocolate I'd ever tasted. She hosted a weekly salon where a rotating cast of expatriates and locals gathered to argue about politics and poetry over wine and cheese that tasted like small miracles. "Diane," she told me during our first real conversation, "you've done something very brave. Not many people find the courage to choose themselves at our age." Our age. Coming from Margox, who was 74 and still flew solo to archaeological digs in Greece every spring, the phrase sounded like an honor instead of a limitation. I remember the first salon I actually stayed for, rather than hovering near the door making polite excuses to leave early. Margox's apartment smelled of orange peel and wood smoke, and I found myself wedged onto a velvet settee between a sculptor named René Ackafer and a retired banker named Julian Roch. Both of them arguing, cheerfully and at volume, about whether Monaco's tax laws had ruined the character of the place or simply made honest what everywhere else pretended not to be. "You're new," René said, turning to me mid-argument like she'd been waiting for an excuse to stop losing to Julian. "Margox says you sold a house in 1 week and moved here with 2 suitcases. Is that true?" "More or less," I admitted. "I sold an accounting practice in London," she said, which took considerably longer, and I still managed to feel like the impulsive one at every dinner party for a decade. "What made you finally do it?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, in a room full of strangers who'd all, in their own way, done the same reckless, necessary thing. "My son told me I needed somewhere more appropriate for a woman my age," I said, "so I found somewhere. It just wasn't the somewhere he had in mind." Julian let out a bark of laughter so loud that Margox, refilling glasses across the room, called over to ask what she'd missed. "She's one of us," he told her, raising his glass to me. Every single person in this room got here because somebody underestimated exactly how much they still had left to build. Renee had had her first gallery show 4 months earlier, 71 years old, sculpting for the first time in her life after 4 decades of balance sheets. Julian served exactly 4 dishes a day at a bistro 2 streets over, perfectly prepared, because after 30 years in banking, he decided he was only ever going to do the parts of a job he actually loved. Listening to them, I understood something I hadn't quite let myself believe yet, that the life I'd built in 3 months wasn't an anomaly, a fluke of good luck and a sold house. It was simply what happened when a certain kind of woman finally stopped waiting for someone else's permission. I'd built routines that felt both foreign and entirely natural. Coffee on the terrace while the harbor woke up, a walk along the coastal path between Monaco and Capdale, afternoons reading beneath palm trees in the Japanese garden, or wandering the outdoor market where vendors called greetings in French and Italian and English, a whole symphony of international commerce. The apartment had slowly filled with small treasures, a watercolor of the harbor painted by a local artist, ceramic bowls from the market in Nice, books in both languages from the little shop on Rue Grimaldi. My grandmother's china cabinet had finally arrived from storage and now held a mix of old heirlooms and new discoveries, a bridge between my 2 lives. But it was the silence from home that told me most clearly how completely my world had shifted. In 3 months, I'd received exactly 4 communications from Ethan. 2 frantic voicemails the first week, both left because I wasn't yet ready to have that conversation. A long email in February, full of apologies and explanations and requests that I come home and work things out. And a birthday card, 2 weeks late, with a generic message about hoping I was well. The birthday card arrived on a day I'd spent at a watercolor class taught by an English artist named Frances Kittredge, who'd been living in Monaco for 20 years. She was my age, vibrant and funny, paint permanently under her fingernails, and she'd found the whole thing entirely on her own terms. After the divorce, she told our class, dabbing cerulean blue onto her canvas, I sold everything and moved to France with 2 suitcases and a determination to find out who I was when I wasn't being someone's wife. Best decision I ever made. Took me 65 years to realize I was the only one responsible for my own happiness. I thought about that sentence for days afterward, turning it over the way I'd once turned over Ethan's word, appropriate, except this one didn't sting at all. It settled into me instead, quiet and true, and I understood that I'd spent 35 years believing patience and passivity were the same thing. That the slow, steady work of raising a child and running a household and showing up for 11 piano lessons a week was somehow a smaller kind of life than the one Ethan and Chloe were building with their gallery openings and their clean lines. It had taken losing that house to understand that patience wasn't the opposite of ambition. It was simply ambition that hadn't been given anywhere to go yet. Ethan's birthday card had felt, by comparison, like an artifact from a previous life, a reminder of obligations I no longer carried. I read it once, felt a brief pang of sadness for the relationship we might have had, and tucked it into a drawer where it couldn't disturb the peace I'd worked so hard to build. My phone rang as I finished my morning coffee, an international number I didn't recognize, though something about the country code felt familiar. Diane Halstead, I answered, a habit I'd developed since arriving. It felt important to claim my full name, to announce myself as a complete person, rather than someone's mother or someone's mother-in-law. Mom, the voice was thin, stretched across an ocean in what felt like years of accumulated misunderstanding. Ethan sounded older somehow, worn down in a way that went beyond a bad connection. Hello, Ethan. Mom, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Your old number was disconnected. I had to hire someone to track down your new information. Hired someone? The phrase hung between us like an admission of just how far we'd drifted, my son paying a stranger to locate his own mother, rather than respecting the space I'd asked for. I've been here, I said simply, living my life. In Monaco, he said, and I heard something in his voice I couldn't quite name, not disapproval exactly, but something close to awe mixed with disbelief. Mom, we need to talk. Really talk. Things have been difficult since you left. I set down my cup and watched a yacht navigate the harbor entrance, its hull cutting through water that sparkled like scattered glass. What's happened? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know yet. There was a long pause, filled with the crackle of a bad connection and what sounded like Ethan gathering the courage for whatever came next. "Chloe left," he said finally. The words should have shocked me. Instead, I felt only a mild curiosity about the details. Chloe had been the architect of my exile, the one who'd convinced Ethan I was too inconvenient for their elegant new life. That she'd abandoned ship the moment their circumstances changed was, in hindsight, entirely predictable. 6 weeks ago, Ethan went on. She went back to her parents, said she couldn't handle the stress of our situation. Our situation. I could read the carefully sanded edges of that phrase. They'd been forced to rent an apartment they couldn't quite afford, to live within their actual means instead of supplementing their lifestyle with mine. Chloe, so confident about curating their perfect life, had discovered that perfection was expensive when you had to pay for it yourself. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. Not sorry Chloe was gone, but sorry Ethan was learning these lessons about love and loyalty the hard way. "Are you," his voice had an edge to it, "you never liked her." That was true, though not for the reasons he probably assumed. I hadn't disliked Chloe because she was wrong for him. I disliked her because she treated me like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be respected. "I'm sorry you're in pain," I said carefully. "Breakups are never easy." "We're not broken up, not officially. She says she needs time to think, but her lawyer already contacted mine about separating assets." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Turns out we don't have many assets to separate." Of course they didn't. They'd been living beyond their means for years, using my house as collateral for a lifestyle they couldn't sustain independently. Now that the foundation had been removed, the whole structure had come down around them. "Where are you living?" "A one-bedroom in Riverdale. It's all I can afford on just my salary and the debt we ran up." Another pause. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I know I don't have the right." Here it comes, I thought. The request for money. The assumption that despite everything, I'd still be available to solve his problems. "You can ask," I said. "I may not be able to help." "I don't want money," he said quickly. "I mean, I could use it, but that's not why I'm calling. I want to understand. I need to understand what I did that was so terrible you had to move to another continent to get away from me." The question caught me off guard with its raw honesty. I'd expected manipulation, or guilt, or anger. I hadn't expected this, genuine confusion about the actual weight of his own choices. "You told me to find my own place," I said. "I know, but I didn't mean. We were trying to help you transition to something more manageable." "More manageable for whom?" Silence. "Ethan, do you remember what you and Chloe said about people my age? About needing somewhere more appropriate, with organized activities and other seniors. We were trying to look out for you." "No," I said firmly. "You were trying to clear me out of your way. There's a difference." I could hear him breathing on the line, and I wondered where he was. His cramped apartment, an office break room, some public place where he'd finally found the nerve to have this conversation. "You're right," he said at last. "We were selfish. I was selfish. I convinced myself we were doing what was best for you, but really, we were doing what was easiest for us." It was the first real acknowledgement I'd heard from him, the first admission that my feelings, my autonomy, had been casualties of their convenience. "Why are you calling now, Ethan?" "Because I miss you," he said, and his voice broke on the words. "Because I've spent 3 months realizing how much of my life was built on assuming you'd always be there to catch me when I fell. And because I want to know if there's any way to earn your forgiveness." Forgiveness? I turned the word over the way you might turn a stone found on a beach, testing its weight, its texture. 3 months earlier, I'd been furious, hurt, determined to prove I was more than a convenient safety net for other people's dreams. Now, sitting on my terrace above one of the most beautiful harbors in the world, surrounded by a life I'd built entirely for myself, the anger felt like it belonged to a different woman. Not because what Ethan had done was acceptable, but because I no longer needed his validation to know exactly what I was worth. "What would forgiveness look like to you?" I asked. "I don't know, a conversation. A chance to apologize properly. To tell you how proud I am of what you've done, even though it scares the hell out of me." Proud, that was a word I hadn't expected. Scared. Mom, you sold everything and moved to Monaco. Most people our parents' age are worried about their prescriptions, and you're living in the most expensive place in Europe like some kind of international woman of mystery. I laughed, surprising myself. Is that how you see me, an international woman of mystery? I see you as someone I clearly never understood, he said. Someone stronger and braver than I ever gave you credit for. Someone who deserved better from me. We talked for another half hour, filling in the shape of our separate lives. He told me about his job, which he was throwing himself into with new purpose now that it was his only real security, about the loneliness of realizing how much of his social life had actually belonged to Chloe, the couples they'd had dinner with, the group chat he'd quietly been dropped from within a month of her leaving, the particular sting of discovering that friendships he'd assumed were his had, in fact, belonged to a partnership rather than a person. I told him about my French lessons, the cooking class where I was learning to make a proper bouillabaisse, the book club that met at the English language bookstore. I keep thinking about something you used to tell me, he said near the end of the call, back when I was a kid and I didn't want to practice piano or finish a project or whatever it was that week. You always said the same thing. You don't have to want to do it. You just have to be the kind of person who does it anyway. I think about that a lot now. Trying to be the kind of person who actually shows up for things, instead of just wanting to be that person. It startled me, hearing my own long-forgotten sentence handed back to me, aged into something that actually meant something to the man saying it. I hadn't thought about that phrase in 20 years. I hadn't imagined it had survived in him at all. I'm glad some of it stuck, I said. More than you know, he said quietly. When we finally said goodbye, something between us had shifted. Not forgiveness, exactly. Understanding. He was beginning to grasp the scope of what he'd lost when he dismissed me so easily, and I was discovering that my happiness had never actually required his suffering to be real. A text from Patricia arrived as I was considering dinner plans that evening. How are you, world traveler? The neighborhood isn't the same without you. Thriving, I typed back, learning French and how to make friends at 68. How's the new family in your house? Lovely people. Grace asked me for the name of whoever did your garden design. I told her it was just you, with love and 30 years of patience. Just me, the phrase made me smile. For so long I'd thought of myself in relation to other people, Walter's wife, Ethan's mother, Chloe's inconvenient obstacle. Here in Monaco, I was simply Diane Halstead. Watercolor student, French learner, terrace gardener and amateur philosopher. That evening I walked to my favorite restaurant, a small place tucked into a side street where the owner, Marcel, greeted regulars like family. He'd saved my usual table on the tiny terrace, where I could watch the last of the daylight fade over the water while eating whatever he recommended from his ever-changing menu. Madame Diane, he said, smiling, comment allez-vous? Très bien, I replied, pleased that the response came automatically now. Tonight I have something special. Fresh langoustines with a light saffron sauce. It sounds perfect. As I settled in with a glass of crisp white wine, I reflected on how much my definition of perfect had changed in 3 months. It used to mean managing everyone else's expectations while minimizing my own. Now it meant langoustines and saffron eaten, while the sun sank into water that stretched to a horizon I'd never seen from any other angle in my life. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Mrs. Halstead, this is Grace Whitlock. I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I wanted you to know your roses are coming up beautifully. The garden is even more spectacular than we imagined. Thank you for creating something so beautiful for us to inherit. I stared at the message, unexpected tears blurring my vision. My roses, planted with such hope for a future I'd once assumed I'd share with Walter forever, were blooming for a family who genuinely appreciated their beauty. The Whitlocks were adding their own touches while respecting what had come before, exactly the way it was supposed to work. I typed back, thank you for telling me. Gardens are meant to be loved. I'm so glad they are in your hands. For the next hour, as my langoustines arrived and the stars appeared over Monaco, I exchanged photos with the woman who now lived in my former house, spring bulbs pushing through soil I'd prepared. The herb garden responding to her careful attention, Climbing roses I'd trained along the back fence beginning to show their first buds. It felt like hearing from a beloved friend, proof that the love I'd poured into that place hadn't disappeared when I left it behind. 2 nights later, at the cooking class, I joined at a small culinary school near the port. Our instructor, a stern, wonderful woman named Odile who tolerated absolutely no shortcuts on stock, paired me with a retired diplomat's wife from Brussels to work through a proper bouillabaisse. My knife work was clumsy, my saffron measurements timid, and Odile corrected both without an ounce of patience for my excuses, which I found, unexpectedly, to be exactly the kind of bracing honesty I hadn't realized I'd missed. Nobody in that kitchen cared how old I was. They cared whether I'd rushed the broth. The book club met the following week at the little English language shop on Rue Grimaldi. 8 of us wedged into folding chairs between the poetry and travel sections, arguing for 2 hours about a novel none of us had fully agreed on. I walked home afterward thinking I hadn't had a conversation that lively about a book since college. Somewhere in the last 30 years, I'd let myself believe that kind of evening belonged to a version of my life that had already closed. It hadn't closed. It had simply been waiting for me to stop being too tired, or too dutiful, or too convenient to walk through the door. Walking home along the harbor that night, stomach pleasantly full, heart lighter than it had been in months, I thought about the strange circularity of it all. Ethan's rejection had forced me to discover my own strength. My leaving had taught him the value of what he'd taken for granted. The house I'd loved and lost was being cherished by people who understood exactly what it was worth. Nothing had gone the way anyone planned, and somehow everything had turned out precisely as it needed to. Back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and began an email. My dear son, thank you for calling today. It meant more than you know to hear your voice and to know you're learning to build a life on your own foundation. I've thought about what you asked about forgiveness and whether there's a path forward for us. The truth is, I forgave you weeks ago, not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying the anger was weighing down my new life. You were thoughtless and hurtful. But you were also operating from assumptions about aging and family and obligation that a lot of people never think to question until it's too late. I don't know if I'll ever move back to the States, but I do know geography was never really what was keeping us apart. If you want a relationship with me, it needs to be built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not convenience and not obligation. I'm not your safety net anymore, Ethan, but I'd like to be your friend. I'm proud of you for facing the consequences of your choices without blaming anyone else. I'm proud of you for asking the hard questions about your own behavior. And I'm hopeful we can build something new, something based on who we actually are instead of who we think we're supposed to be. With love from Monaco, where your mother is learning that life doesn't end at 68. It just gets more interesting. Mom. I read it twice before sending it, making sure every word was true, that I wasn't offering more than I was ready to give, or less than his honesty had earned. 6 months later, Ethan came to visit. He'd saved for months to afford the trip, staying in a modest hotel near the port, spending his days exploring Monaco with the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing the world through entirely fresh eyes. I can't believe this is your life, he said on his second day, as we sat on my terrace sharing lunch, vegetables from the market, fish so fresh it had probably still been swimming that morning. Some days I can't believe it either, I admitted, but it feels real now, it feels like home. He'd changed since our phone call, and not just physically, though he was thinner and looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. There was a new humility in his manner, a carefulness in how he spoke, as though he'd finally learned to think before reacting. I've been in therapy, he said, without my asking, trying to understand how I became someone who could treat you the way I did. What have you learned? That I inherited Dad's sense of entitlement without his work ethic. That I confused loving you with owning you. That I never really thought of you as a separate person with your own needs and your own dreams. It was a more thorough accounting than I'd expected, and more honest than I'd dared to hope for. And Chloe, gone for good. The divorce was finalized last month. He shrugged, though I could see the hurt still sitting behind his eyes. Turns out she loved our lifestyle more than she loved me once I couldn't provide the lifestyle anymore. I'm sorry. I'm not really. It hurts, but it clarifies things too. I'd rather be alone than be with someone who sees me as a means to an end. We spent the week rebuilding our relationship on new terms. I showed him my favorite corners of the city, introduced him to Margox and Francis, let him see the whole shape of the life I'd built for myself. He was genuinely curious about all of it, my daily routines, my choices, my plans for the future, asking questions instead of assuming answers, which felt, more than anything else that week, like the actual measure of how much he'd changed. One afternoon, we walked the market together, and I watched him linger over a stall of second-hand books, pulling out a battered French edition of a novel he recognized from a college course he'd hated at the time. "Dad would have loved this," he said, turning it over in his hands, and it was the first time in over a year either of us had mentioned Walter without the conversation curdling into something painful. He always said he wanted to actually use his French someday instead of just keeping the textbooks. He'd have driven Louis up the wall within a week, I said, and Ethan laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind I hadn't heard from him since he was a much younger man. He bought the book. I don't know if he ever read it, but I know he kept it on the shelf in his new apartment in Atlanta, because Priya mentioned it, months later, almost in passing, as though it were simply a fact about the furniture rather than something either of us needed to make anything of. On his last night, we had dinner at Marcel's, where Ethan struggled gamely with his high school French and charmed the staff by trying dishes he couldn't pronounce. "I have something to tell you," he said over dessert, a local specialty involving honey and almonds and old tradition. "Good news, I think. I've been offered a promotion. Regional manager, Southeast. It would mean relocating to Atlanta. Better money, real responsibility." "That's wonderful. You should be proud." "I am, but it also means I'd be even further from you if you ever decided to come back to the States." I smiled at the careful way he'd phrased it, not assuming my decisions, only acknowledging how his own might land on them. "Ethan, I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back to take care of you. I'm not coming back to be convenient or available or appropriately aged. If I ever do come back, it will be because I choose it for my own reasons. I know, I'm not asking you to come back for me. I just hope geography doesn't mean we can't keep building whatever this is. Technology exists," I pointed out, "and airplanes. We don't need to live in the same zip code to be part of each other's lives. Is that what you want, to be part of each other's lives?" I looked at my son across that table, the man I'd raised and loved and lost and found again. He wasn't the little boy who used to tell me I was his best friend in the world, but he wasn't the entitled young man who told me to find my own place either. He was someone new, shaped by consequence and loss and the slow, uneven work of actually growing up. "Yes," I said, on equal terms, with mutual respect and genuine affection, but yes. The relief on his face was so complete it made my chest ache. I drove him to the airport the next morning, and we talked about practical things, his new job, my ongoing French lessons, the possibility of a Christmas visit. But underneath, the logistics sat something deeper, a shared recognition that we'd both changed in fundamental ways, that the people saying goodbye at that gate were not the same two people who'd fought in my kitchen months earlier. "Thank you," he said, hugging me goodbye at security. "For what?" "For showing me that love doesn't mean accepting poor treatment. For teaching me that people your age aren't just waiting around to disappear. For proving it's never too late to choose yourself." I watched him vanish into the terminal, carrying lessons learned the hard way, and a new understanding of what family could actually mean when it was built on choice instead of obligation. That afternoon, I sat on my terrace with a glass of wine and an email from a real estate agent, reviewing apartments in Monaco I'd been looking to purchase, ready to make my temporary adventure permanent. One in particular had caught my eye, a newer building with a rooftop garden and views of both the sea and the mountains rising behind the principality. More expensive than my rental, but well within reach, thanks to the house sale and 3 decades of Walter's quiet, careful investing. More than anything, it felt like home in a way nowhere had since before he died. I was drafting my reply when my phone rang. Patricia's name lit up the screen, and I answered with the automatic smile her calls always brought. "Diane Halstead, International Woman of Mystery," she said, without preamble. "How was the visit with Ethan?" "Complicated, but good. We're different people than we were 6 months ago." People can change, given the right motivation, apparently. "So, any chance you're coming back to town?" It was the question everyone kept asking, the one I'd been avoiding answering directly, because I hadn't been ready to close that particular door for good. "Patricia," I said slowly, "what if I told you I was thinking about staying here? Permanently. What if I said that at 68, I'd finally found the place where I want to spend whatever years I have left? I'd say it's about damn time Diane Halstead put herself first," she said without a beat of hesitation. "And I'd ask when I can come visit this paradise you've found." I laughed, feeling something settle into place in my chest, like a key finally finding its lock. "How's next month? I'm thinking of buying an apartment with a guest room that has an ocean view." "Book me a flight," Patricia said. "It's about time I had an adventure too." After we hung up, I opened the email to the agent and typed my answer. "I'd like to schedule a viewing tomorrow morning. I'm ready to make an offer." As the sun set over Monaco, for what might have been the 1,000th time since I'd arrived, I thought about the strange road that had brought me here. Ethan's demand that I find my own place had been meant as a dismissal, a convenient way to clear me out of his path. Instead, it had turned out to be the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. I had found my own place. Not in a facility where I could be managed and contained, but in one of the most beautiful corners of the earth, where every day brought new possibility, and every sunset promised another tomorrow to fill however I chose. At 68, I finally understood that life doesn't end when your children stop needing you. It doesn't end when your husband dies, or when the people around you start using your age like a leash. It ends only when you stop believing in your own capacity for joy, for growth, for wonder. I'd nearly made that mistake once. I'd nearly let other people's small idea of what my life should look like become my whole reality. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to choose yourself, the world hands you back more than you ever thought to ask for. Tomorrow, I'd look at an apartment with a terrace that caught the morning light against the mountains. I'd imagine my grandmother's china cabinet in the living room, my books on the built-in shelves, my coffee routine unfolding in a kitchen that would be mine for as long as I wanted it. Tonight, I'd fall asleep to the sound of the Mediterranean lapping against the shore, in a bed I'd chosen, in a life I'd built entirely on my own terms, in a city where Diane Halstead had finally become exactly who she was always meant to be. My son once told me it was time I found somewhere appropriate for a woman my age. I did. It has a view of the sea, and no one there has ever once used that word against me. I closed on the apartment on a Tuesday in April. Exactly 14 months after I'd signed the papers on the house I'd raised Ethan in. And I remember thinking, standing in the notary's office with a pen in my hand, that it was the second time in just over a year I'd signed my name to something that would change the entire shape of my life. This time, nobody had to explain the fine print to me twice. Patricia arrived 3 weeks later, exactly as promised, dragging a suitcase twice the size mine had been when I'd left, and stood on my new terrace with her mouth actually open. "I'm going to need you to explain to me," she said, turning in a slow circle to take in the sea on one side and the mountains rising green and gold on the other, "how you were living 40 minutes from me for 15 years, and I never once suspected you had this in you." "I don't think I had it in me," I told her. "I think it was always there. Nobody had ever pushed hard enough to find out." She stayed 9 days, and by the end of it she'd learned 3 phrases in French, fallen slightly in love with Marcel's langoustines, and made Margot's promise to save her a seat at the next salon. On her last night, the two of us sat on the terrace with wine and the last of the daylight, and she asked me the question I think she'd been building up to the entire visit. "Do you ever miss it? The old life? Not the house, I know you don't miss the house. I mean the version of you who lived there." I thought about it honestly. The way I'd promised myself, I'd think about every hard question this whole year had put in front of me. Some days, I admitted, I missed the woman who thought she had more time to figure things out. I don't miss the woman who thought being needed and being valued were the same thing. It took losing the house to understand they aren't. Ethan's promotion had taken him to Atlanta that same spring, and to my genuine surprise, distance seemed to make him more consistent rather than less. He called most Sundays now, an ordinary, unremarkable habit that had somehow become the thing I looked forward to more than almost anything else in my week. We didn't talk about the house anymore, or Chloe, or the 2 weeks he'd once given me to disappear. We talked about his new apartment, which he'd furnished, he told me proudly, entirely with pieces he'd chosen and paid for himself. We talked about a woman named Priya he'd started seeing, a structural engineer who, according to Ethan, had absolutely no patience for entitlement of any kind, and had told him so, gently but plainly, on their second date. "I think you'd like her," he said, the Sunday he finally worked up the nerve to mention her. "She reminds me a little of you, actually. She doesn't let anybody get away with anything." "That does sound promising," I said, and meant it. He came back to visit that Christmas, and this time he brought Priya, who spent our first dinner together asking me thoughtful, specific questions about the piano lessons, about Walter's business, about exactly how a woman builds a life quietly enough that the people closest to her never notice how much of it she's actually carrying. On her second night in Monaco, she found me alone on the terrace after dinner and told me, without any preamble, that Ethan had described the whole story to her before their first date, not to excuse himself, she said, but because he'd wanted her to understand exactly what kind of family she was walking into, and exactly what kind of mistake he never intended to make twice. "I appreciated that," she told me. "Most people wait until it's already too late to tell you who they used to be." I liked her enormously, and I told Ethan so before he left, and I watched something in his face loosen with relief, the particular relief of a grown man who still, after everything, wanted his mother's approval and had finally learned to ask for it honestly instead of assuming he was owed it. The house on Bay Street, my old house, though I'd stopped thinking of it that way sometime around the first spring, sent me photographs every few months from Grace Whitlock, unprompted, the way you'd send updates to a friend rather than a stranger who used to own your address. The roses I'd trained along the back fence had their best bloom in a decade, Grace wrote that June. She'd added a small vegetable bed near my old herb garden and wanted to know if I had any advice about the soil. I sent her 3 paragraphs about compost and sun exposure and felt, typing them, an entirely uncomplicated kind of joy. The joy of watching something you built outlive the version of your life it was built inside of. I still teach, in a smaller way than I used to. 3 students now, all adults, all expatriates like me who wanted to learn piano for the first time in their 50s and 60s, and were tired of being told it was too late to start something new. I don't charge them, mostly, though Julian insists on paying me in meals, which I've come to think is the better currency anyway. Some mornings, sitting on my terrace with coffee going cold while I watch the light change over the water, I think about that word Chloe used, standing at my grandmother's vanity a year and a half ago now, appropriate. I think about how certain she was that she understood exactly what a woman my age deserved, and how completely, spectacularly wrong she turned out to be. I don't know what became of her in the end. Ethan mentioned once, briefly, that she'd moved to Austin, that she was engaged again to someone in commercial real estate, that she seemed, by every account, entirely unchanged by any of it. I found I didn't have much curiosity left to spend on the answer. Some people spend their whole lives being certain, and never once find out what it costs the people around them to keep being certain for them. I, on the other hand, spent 68 years finding out exactly what I was capable of the moment someone finally stopped deciding it for me. The apartment is fully mine now, deed, mortgage, every French document with my name at the top and no one else's. I've started looking, lately, at a small storefront 2 streets from Marcel's, empty since a florist retired last winter, wondering, in the idle way you wonder about things before you've quite decided to do them, whether Monaco might have room for a proper piano studio after all. I haven't mentioned it to anyone yet, not even Patricia. I've learned, this past year, that some plans are worth keeping to yourself a little longer, just to make sure they're really yours before you hand them to anyone else's opinion. Some evenings, closing up the apartment before bed, I still catch myself standing at the French doors a moment longer than I need to, looking out at the lights strung along the harbor. And I think about that folder Barrett drew up at my kitchen table all those years ago, the one Ethan slid across to me with such careful, well-meaning confidence. I think about how certain everyone was at every stage of this, that they understood exactly what I was capable of. Ethan, Chloe, even Walter's own gentle assumption, all those years, that the numbers were better left to him while I handled everything that didn't show up on a balance sheet. None of them were wrong to love me. They were only wrong about the size of me. I don't think that's a rare mistake for a woman who spends 4 decades making herself easy to overlook in the specific, useful ways a family requires. I think it happens quietly, in kitchens exactly like mine, to women exactly like I used to be, more often than anyone wants to admit out loud. I only got the chance to prove it wrong because someone finally said the word appropriate to my face, instead of just thinking it. My son told me, at 68 years old, that it was time I found my own place. He was right. He just never imagined, not for 1 second, exactly how far I'd be willing to go to find it, or how completely I'd learn to love the woman waiting for me once I got there. If you've made it this far with me, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Revenge Lab, because I have a feeling you already understand something it took me 68 years to learn, that it's never too late to stop being convenient and start being free. I'd love to have you with me for the next story.